All right, we're going to get started with our last session for this afternoon, which is Governing Towards Strategy for Unphishable Enterprise Credentials from Capital One. And we have Kiran Mantrapanega and Vaibhav Gupta coming in remotely for this session. So let's hand it over to them for their session. Thank you.
Back in the 19th century, 1872 actually, a book was published called Around the World in 80 Days. And as the name says, it describes a journey around the globe in those times. Now, over a slew of different types of transportations, and not just traditional trains, roadways, ships, even animal-powered carts, and even an elephant ride. More recently, in 2018, it took a total of only 3 layovers with a commercial airline. Much lesser number of hours, not just days. What's the relevance to this conference, you'd ask, right? And that's quite what we're going to get to in this session today. Hello, and welcome to this virtual session of Authenticate 2021. My name is Vaibhav Gupta. I work at Capital One in the Cyber CTO's office on roadmap outcomes and formulating cyber strategies for identity security across all of our lines of businesses. Not just for our customers, but for our business partners, our staff, our commercial software products, even our internal legacy systems. And in this session about unphishable credentials, rather than any commercialized catering of identity needs, what we are going to discuss is more of an enterprise usage of identity solutions. And I'm joined by my colleague, Kiran. Kiran?
Thank you, Vaibhav. Hello there. I'm Kiran Mantrapanega, and I manage the risk and compliance programs for Capital One's identity and access management team. In this session today, I'm excited to share my thoughts and experiences on the risk-based adoption of what we call the secure authentication or the passwordless, and the journey from the legacy authentication to the modern authentication, which is more passwordless. Back to you, Vaibhav.
Cool. Well, thank you, Kiran. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a background and a little bit of touch upon the strategy before coming around to conclusion. And between us, we'll be discussing during this session today. And to start off with, I would take a step back and bring in the thought, mergers and acquisitions generally are one of the most common ways that companies grow and they sustain their markets. Mergers and acquisitions, as we all know, also bring along not just the business outcomes on the technology that comes along, but they also bring along a lot of tech debt, right? And then it takes years and years to sort through and clear that up. So with multiple M&As over several years, typical large enterprises just keep adding on processes, procedures, teams, technologies, and most of that technology includes not just the consumers that they are servicing, but also their internal workforce and staff and other functions which are supportive. So this kind of includes, to a large extent, identity management systems. And that's the topic of our discussion today, right? ID proofing, ID creation, provisioning, lifecycle management, access management, authentication, governance, all of that comes along. And from a technology standpoint, not just different IDP systems, it also comes along a lot of credential stores and credential management systems. Now, each of these, for example, for credential management and user repositories, right? For example, if different mergers and acquisitions have brought along different user stores, Active Directories, for example, they would come in with their own different diverse password complexities, their technology versions, even distributed or even disjoint user repositories that get accumulated over the years. Now, each of those would then have their own downstream applications. Downstream applications, localized applications that are integrated with those companies, for example. And when you merge or acquire those companies, they come along. Now, imagine a user experience of a staff member, employee, traversing from one application to another that's kind of onboarded to these different localized solutions that may or may not have adopted to what people generally call SSOs, and I call that seamless sign-on, single sign-on. But the point is that it kind of ends up becoming quite like that trip in the olden days, right? Changing the mode of travel, the seating, the ease and the convenience, and as well as not just the guarantee of passing across, but even the security that comes along. Now that was then. And you'd say SSO solves that problem. But the fact is that all centralized IAM solutions work only for those downstream applications which are onboarded to these centralized applications. Which means if there are, let's say, if you have 5,000, even if you have 1,000 applications, and only a few of them have been onboarded to your central IAM solution, right? What about the rest of them? Right? When people have to go from one to another, combine that with the fact that there are localized legacy solutions, there are non-centrally managed app implementations. Just think of the user journey, right? It takes the user's journey across those applications back to that novel from the olden days. And now take a step back and think that it's not just the user experience, but it's a company's ability to move forward into adopting those modern solutions. And we're going to get to the topic about FIDO2 and unphishable credentials in a moment. But the fact that all of these disjoint systems or unadopted systems, they kind of pose a challenge and hindrance in moving forward. And then come along the pull from the industry, the pull from regulatory requirements, audit requirements, compliance expectations. And that's not just that, right? From a cyber perspective, there are bad actors who keep pressure testing your systems, and not just from an infrastructure, but you would notice a lot of our identity breach or breaches in the past or in the recent past have been identity breaches. Now the complexity doesn't stop there. Everybody's adopting the cloud, right? And people are doing it either as point solutions or hybrid solutions. Either they're fast-paced or they're doing it ground up, and it's a huge complex situation. So the question is, how do you get across to the other side of adopting a unified experience, quite compared to modern airliners that I was talking about earlier, versus the experience that was there back in the 19th century, right? And the leap comes not just with the continuous pursuit of technology, it also is from pausing to think and strategizing your path forward. Questions like, and I'm taking up a lot of time, and I'm going to get to conclude this part in a minute, and I'll hand it over to Kiran. But there are things like questions like, is this even the right thing to adopt, in siloed implementations? Or is passive proliferation in different Active Directory domains, should you directly jump from multiple AD domains, for example, to passwordless? Should you go through U2F? Should you build ground up, or should you just chase after the shiny toys, right? And all of these, maybe even to the fact that should you let go of your AD and move into Azure? Things like not just Azure, any cloud-based identity solution. Should you own your identities, or should you outsource them to a SaaS provider? Now, the point is that while you're working on your identity strategy, right, think of the full picture. Identify gaps in not just adoption across the applications, but even your various user personas. And then factor in non-centralized legacy tech, to avoid standalone experiences. So the key there is to have your cyber standards and policies be the backbone, whether it's signing new legal contracts with the third-party service providers, your capability assessments when purchasing costs, even when dealing with staff augmentation suppliers, right? And that's where governance and audit functions come in. Governance not just of your centralized solutions, but even for downstream applications, as well as applications which have not yet adopted. So before I get to the bottom line of this journey, I'll take a pause there. Kiran, you have been a lot more closer in getting some of these applications adopted, right, across enterprise. I'll hand it over to you, and please share your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So great thoughts, Vaibhav. Absolutely. There are a lot of risks out there, a lot of solutions out there for companies to adopt and things like that. But before we talk about any solution, rolling out different solutions, what works right for an enterprise or not, let's talk about what are the risks that we're trying to solve here, right? When we talk about secure authentication, well, typically or historically, we've been using the typical credential ways of using the user credentials like a password and username to log into any system or an asset, right? And there are a lot of risks associated to that. One, users tend to reuse the same credentials for multiple services, that first becomes like the single point of failure, right? And then the second thing is administrators usually have a lot of challenges managing those credentials across various systems and monitoring those and controlling those. Like, for example, even if we have to talking about cyber standards and policies, rolling out password policies and requirements across various applications in your enterprise and controlling them and auditing, managing the audit trails for them becomes a nightmare, right? That also opens doors, and it becomes, provides opportunities for malicious threat actors to easily crack those passwords and gain access to those user credentials, which will then lead to compromised credentials. And of late, we've been seeing a lot in the news, the data breaches, the data theft, phishing attacks, all those things that are on the news these days. Combining with those security risks, regulations play a big role in here. Compliance, right? We all know the financial industry, being regulated by FFIEC, then IC, and then we have the PCI DSS requirements and the GDPR requirements. All these requirements, implicitly or explicitly, they require strong authentication solutions. And being in violation with any of those requirements isn't a place where the organizations want to be, right? So investing in a secure authentication solution is a recommended approach to fight off these attacks and phishing attacks or intrusions, and it has the benefit of keeping the company compliant. So implicitly or explicitly, all these regulations require strong authentication solutions, right? And being in violation with any of these regulatory requirements isn't a place where we want to be. So the solution is investing in a secure authentication solution, which will fight off the phishing attacks and intrusions and has the attached benefit of keeping the organization compliant with all these regulations. So we know we have to be compliant with regulations. We know we have to address the risks, but how do we get from point A to point B? And how can we secure the organization, right? So moving from legacy authentication, which is user ID and password, to a more modern authentication, which is user ID, password with an added layer of security, like your multi-factor authentication, or moving towards the passwordless solution. And that itself is a journey. And we all know that we cannot go from point A to point Z without a journey, right? So the key is to understand the path, the route, and the risks that are in your journey, and plan for those ahead in time. So first step in your journey is to get control over the applications in your organization. So dig up your CMDB, dig up any asset management system that an organization has, or any other applications, that tool that gives you an idea of total number of applications in your enterprise. And create an inventory. Understand what type of authentication those applications are using, legacy, any new applications being onboarded, and things like that. Once you have the inventory, we all know that federation reduces the risk, right? Friction. Hence, group those applications that can be authenticated via single sign-on. So here, your journey of single sign-on begins. Create a portal for those, and so that way, once you group those, deploying other passwordless solutions or your modern authentication solutions becomes easy and less challenging. And once SSO is rolled out, then plan out for your next phase, which is rolling out the MFA. So rolling out MFA to thousands of applications in the enterprise could be challenging and daunting, because applications teams have to work with various MFA technology stacks to roll out the MFA solution. And most companies, that becomes a point of failure, and they often face a lot of resistance from the app teams. The solution is adopt a risk-based approach. So risk rank your applications from the inventory that you've already created and identify opportunities where by applying this MFA or the modern authentication will reduce the risk profile and get you biggest bang for the buck. In this journey, you'll also identify and become aware of a lot of these legacy apps, unprotected services, and unknown apps. So organizations should develop a risk-based approach around those applications as well. So far we talked about going from legacy authentication to rolling out MFA using a risk-based approach. Now let's see how can we get from this point to the next phase, which is more your passwordless solution, right? So, and in that phase, in that journey, the first thing that you do is increase the trust in authentication. So the first step we need to do is identify and understand all the devices being used in your authentication mechanism, like devices used to access the asset, devices used to access as used as secondary factor for authentication. And then the next step is to establish the device trust. So this is done by performing continuous risk detection. So gather data from various activity logs, your SIM tools, like examples like users logging in from abnormal IP addresses or malware detected in any devices. So any risk that you identify from all these data that is being gathered could be used to analyze the user persona, can be used to analyze the authentication mechanisms used. And then based on this data and the regulations that are being, the requirements that are being driven by the regulations, what we need to do is make intelligent decisions. So gather these data, make intelligent decisions by developing policies and apply those policies. Then monitor the risk profile by applying these rules and policies. Once we know we are at that phase where we are making intelligent decisions through the risk or the risk profiles of these various applications and the data being gathered through to your devices and SIM logs and all that. The next phase in your journey is to select some use cases and groups to implement passwordless solution, right? So the key to this in this journey and in this step especially is optimizing the architecture, right? So use and adopt architecture that can be applied to various use cases. So sustainability is what we're talking about here. Once we roll out to certain use cases, rinse and repeat, identify another use case and roll out the solution. So in this journey, in each phase, you'll identify your challenges, identify the risks, come up with the mitigating action plan for each of those risks as you roll out the next phase. Next, in your rinse and repeat process, make sure those risks identified in the previous step are being addressed, and you create a fresh risk log. So continue to federate, continue to put more applications behind the SSO and then your passwordless portal. And that gets you from your legacy, your journey from your legacy authentication to a more modern and secure authentication methods. And the key here is to plan ahead and continue and start your journey.
Kiran, I really loved your part about the rinse and repeat piece. That completely makes sense. In fact, and I would just add, I think this kind of applies to not just the workforce and staff augmentation resources. It kind of also applies to business partners, any third-party suppliers as well. And you bring up those great points about the devices that people are using, the endpoints that people are using, and if we take this out one step ahead, not just from our workforce and staff augmentation suppliers, consumers and partners are very different again. Because primarily, I think, and to your point, the accountability of that account security, identity security, then kind of becomes shared. From an enterprise standpoint, when an enterprise or the cyber standards and stuff can enforce that people have to change their passwords every 90 days or whatever duration, right? You can't really have those same kind of requirements and expectations from your end consumers. In those cases, I think just an additional side thought there, because when we think of FIDO and authentication and secure authentication, stronger authentication. Just taking a step aside and talking about additionally, not just from workforce and staff, but thinking about consumers, user personas, I think, make a huge difference in that case, and they come in super handy because those are the ones that help us structure and outline the implementation of these strategies, right? And if your strategy already accounts for, like let's say consumer adoption for behavioral and risk-based authentication, consumer adoption via some consumers, you might want to identify a persona that relies on all sorts of modern technologies, and they have a tablet and they have an iPhone and whatever device, smartphones and stuff. They would rather rely on push notifications, but they would also want to be able to access your services across different devices. So the digital experience that then you build into relies on how securely you can keep those identities across devices for consumers. And then comes the other user persona about where those users would kind of require MFA not just push notifications, but kind of SMS and traditional OTPs. So from a consumer standpoint as well, taking that topic ahead, I think it's important to consider various different aspects and come up with your own strategy. So what I'm trying to say is whether it's consumers, business, workforce, staff augmentation, or even system level or bot protection, anything that you're upping to make your authentication stronger, right? The intent here is that we should have an overall organization strategy. Let that be the backbone and kind of the central nervous system. That's one thing. And then add that a governing body, like Kiran mentioned, which will act as the hands and feet in your organization to have that cyber strategy implemented. Right? And the core towards identity security, it's just that it has grown so much prominence over these years, right? It has always been a critical component for cybersecurity. And as we move away from centralized storage of credentials and passwords, identity has featured high on overall cyber strategies. So the point being, be more proactive than reactive. Don't just rely on the industry to tell you what you should do. Don't just rely on other different signals and market signals on how you should adopt. Assess your own landscape, right? Build a bridge in getting across to the outcomes that you identify. And don't just shoot for the quick wins, right? And not just the next shiny toy. In your strategy, take care of your baggage. Which brings me to the point, Kiran, from your experience, what do you think is the biggest challenge in this top-down governance approach anyways? Because companies can make sure that the top-down management approach is implemented, but in your opinion, how do people decide what is the right decision and how do they get it implemented?
Yep. So you actually mentioned something very key, very critical thing a couple of minutes ago about shared responsibility. I think that has a huge impact. So historically, teams have been working in silos, right? The information was not communicated across the board. Authentication is now not like a technology issue, right? It's an organization-wide decision. It's an organization-wide implementation to make. The culture now has to change, and teams have to recognize that everything has to be integrated and connected. So how does that happen? And to your point, the decisions have to be made at the top level, and it has to flow from top, it has to be a top-down approach. But how will the decision management make the decisions? Only if we feed the right data to the management so they can make informed decisions, right? So teams have to feed right data to board, to the management, and we need to take a closer look. And all that, again, boils down to risks. We need to take a look at what are our risks, to your point, what are our gaps, and what strategies what are the possible strategies or solutions we need to close those gaps or to remediate those risks. And oftentimes, when the data gets to the management, it's either too granular or it is too high level that the main idea or the key points are often the message is often missed. What we need to make sure, like it could be dashboards, it could be reports, or whatever that is, that the data should be fed and the risks have to be socialized to management at the right level. and with the right detail, right? So I think from what I have seen, like the recent breaches and the ransomware attacks have been like eye-opening incidents, and that have hit all the boardrooms, and there has been a shift definitely in the way companies have been addressing these risks and making decisions. So I definitely do agree, Vaibhav, that enterprises or companies have to move from the reactive mode to the more proactive mode by strategizing everything and try to determine what is the right approach for the company. And it is definitely a tailored approach. It's not like one size fits all, right? So it definitely has to be an informed, integrated approach, a collaborative approach from within the teams. And the message has to go up to the management to be able to make the right decisions for the enterprise.
Yeah. No, I would certainly echo those thoughts there, Kiran. Very well said. In conclusion, I think what we are overall trying to get to, tell me if you want to add more to that, certainly. I think moving forward, we have to take care of our baggage. We can't just drop it, and we can't just litter our path, because then we have to get back and take care of it later. And balancing security with usability, if we know what kind of journey is important to the organization, that in that sense, don't just go for the easy wins, I guess. I think what you're saying is, build it ground up. Even if we know something is our North Star, adopt and evolve as we grow. Any final thoughts?
No, you're spot on. It's definitely not an easy journey, like you said. We need to go take a phased approach, take a risk-based approach, learn from what we've done, and then move on. And like you said, there's always the trade-off between the user adaptability and then the security. So we need to understand all that, put the right balance, and make the right decision and roll out the strategy that is right for the organization and the users.
Yep, completely agreed. Well, I guess this brings us to the conclusion of our talk today. Certainly appreciate your time and partnership, and thankful to Authenticate and the conference hosts and organizers and everybody for giving us the opportunity. Hope to catch everybody else sometime in person, maybe next year or coming years, one of those times. But thank you for your time, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.